Before the second part of the lecture, speaking about the relationship between politics and universities and how autonomous they are. It came to my mind that the Bucharest University repeatedly claims that one of its main goals is to prepare the students for the work market. And that we can assume that might come from the Faculty of Economic Studies or the Faculty of Education Studies. But anyone knows that work market is unpredictable and big changes are in place. So if you are really someone committed to scientific knowledge, you cannot prepare the students for the work market because you simply don't know how the market will look like. So that shows that the Bucharest University and other Romanian universities use a political statement and not their own knowledge. Now coming back to the lecture, looking at the current involvement of the political in scientific research, we should start with the funding practices. Political authorities, scientific bureaucrats, managers of higher education and research institutions decide about the financial support, and the politically minded researchers are the first to employ what they know in order to get it. The most important of these practices is evaluation. In Pierre Bourdieu's view, the restriction of evaluation to peers generates quality. The current systems of evaluation, which have begun to proliferate 25 years ago, claim to rely on assessments by peers chosen by the evaluating agencies and assembled in panels. But this way of financing has still to prove its usefulness. All the major scientific breakthroughs were made before its introduction, and I'm not aware of any comparable achievements coming out of grant-supported research systems. In Romania, in the case of evaluations made for ranking those who want better positions in the systems, they proceed according to the guidelines elaborated by panels, grouping local experts chosen by the Ministry of Education, in which the published research and that presented in conferences are transformed into points, a minimum of points being required for each rank. The thinking behind this is quantitative. A researcher with more points is declared better than one who has fewer points. The obvious outcome is that the researchers try to publish more, to participate to more conferences, to publish more books, for which they will get more points than for the papers, and to read less because no one quantifies that. The quality of the publications is determined by ranking publishing houses and scientific journals, and that of the conferences by ranking them according to participation and venue. We get more points for participating in international conferences than we get for being present at national ones. Other evaluations are made in order to grant financial support for particular scientific projects, supposed to be the best according to the guidelines produced with the help of scientists who in this way become experts. Here a distinction made by some sociologists between experts and researchers is useful. Experts are not researchers. The knowledge they produce is not subjected to critical and skeptical examination, something one would expect from researchers. It is evaluated by institutions that choose and employ them according to their interests and policies. institutions governed by political and business interests which want to make scientific knowledge useful for a particular purpose. The careers of the experts tend to become less dependent on what other researchers think, and more on their capacity to display the qualities and knowledge required by the employers. The resulting calls for applications, frequently with undisclosed authors, are expected to generate compliance, if not strict obedience. The researchers have to imagine their research according to their guidelines, even if what they find in them does not match what they think they should find. Because of that, some of them engage in what an archaeologist, Elizabeth Nicholson, has termed application poetry, a textual display of conformity. The applicants cannot criticize the calls for applications. Not even the panels that review their projects. Frequently, the panels are not made of the experts who made the calls for applications, but not even those panels are allowed to do that. As I learned during my participation to one such panel, I cannot give many details. I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, but what I can say is that I supported an archaeological project proposed by a very diverse team, which included from classical archaeologists to archaeologists specialized in archaeometry. But it was rejected because the call for applications demanded interdisciplinarity. And for the panel, they were all archaeologists. Compliance and obedience are what politicians expect from their followers. They are not epistemic virtues that might power the advancement of knowledge. David Graeber noticed this, and I'm quoting from him. Common sense dictates that if you want to maximize scientific creativity, you find some bright people, give them the resources they need to pursue whatever idea comes into their heads, and then leave them alone for a while. Most will probably turn up nothing, but one or two may well discover something completely unexpected. If you want to minimize the possibility of unexpected breakthroughs, tell those same people that they will receive no resources at all unless they spend the bulk of their time competing against each other to convince you they already know what they are going to discover. A consequence of this system is that it encourages grantmanship, the art of acquiring financial grants. Sometimes this is done by specialized persons, either internal or external to the research team. However, many funding agencies insist that the researchers themselves write the applications and the progress reports, and that takes a lot of their research time. David Graeber cites Jonathan Katz, who has published a small piece called "Don't Become a Scientist." You will spend, I'm quoting from this, you will spend your time writing proposals rather than doing research. Worse, because your proposals are judged by your competitors, you cannot follow your curiosity, but must spend your effort and talents in anticipating and deflecting criticism rather than on solving important scientific problems. It is proverbial that original ideas are the kiss of death for a proposal because they have not yet been proved to work. The most damaging consequence of this financing system is the equivalence between getting money and knowing something. And then the ensuing disruption of peer-to-peer evaluation systems. Grantees are encouraged to ignore what their less fortunate colleagues think. And also support for a representation of scientific research as an outcome of personal prowess, not of collective efforts. No wonder that some researchers are now closer to boastful entrepreneurs, proud of what they are going to sell, than to skeptical and cautious scientists who want to present their knowledge as truthful as possible, to take into account the limitations of what they know, because in this way they can explore what can be done about them. Another area of political intervention in the scientific field is interdisciplinarity, especially in archaeology. Much of the current talk about interdisciplinarity, especially that coming from policymakers in matters of scientific research, is puzzling because it claims that the adoption of theories and analytical devices across disciplines is something new. It is not. The history of all disciplines show how crucial such borrowings were since the beginnings. The scientific disciplines were not born from looking at the objects which now they claim to be their own. They assembled and cultivated ways of looking at them that were available. A good example is typology. For many archaeologists, the main archaeological method, together with chronology and mapping. Typology was not invented by archaeologists. It was borrowed in the 19th century from zoology and botanics. The talk about interdisciplinarity is similar to the talk about internationalization of research, very common in Romania, another kind of political intervention. In Romania, from time to time, we have to listen to people who have positions in state institutions and take care of scientific research, especially during conferences in which we all make our presentations in English. And they insist that we should make efforts to present our work to the wild world, especially to the world that matters, that is Western Europe and the United States. However, all disciplines are international. National ways of doing science should not exist. There are, however, local pressures that lead to a uniformization of research, but that is not beneficial to scientific knowledge. Such internationalization discourses are meant to elevate politics above scientific knowledge. Bureaucrats and politicians above everyone else on the grounds that they know what is good for us. And they do that because their knowledge is better than ours. For archaeologists, some such prescriptions are pointless. The main journal of my institute, Dacia, published since 1957, does not publish in Romania. Romanian archaeologists must know German if they want to read some very important papers published by Romanian archaeologists only in German during the 1970s and 1980s, as they have now to know English in order to read papers published by Romanian archaeologists during the last 20 years. Coming back to interdisciplinarity, most researchers accept the central claim of a discourse about interdisciplinarity, that it provides superior knowledge by assembling several disciplines, and therefore that interdisciplinary pursuits are better than disciplinary ones. This claim is demonstrably false. All the major scientific achievements are the results of disciplinary work. Much interdisciplinary work does not produce much beyond the fact that it can be seen as interdisciplinary. Sometimes it's ridiculous. I have in mind a project which examined the consequences of wearing heavy armor in the Middle Ages. And I want to choose a reaction of Guy Holson to this. I hope you can see it. I'm trying to get funding from my own groundbreaking theory, which is that I hypothesize that getting shot through the head is a deeply unpleasant and indeed frequently fatal experience, and that this might have had a bearing on the outcome of many of history's most famous battles. I'm hoping to carry out some trials on various government ministers and university vice chancellors and their henchmen. First, though, I need to find me a marine microbiologist to head up the project. The idea that more disciplines automatically produce better scientific results on any topic better than only one is an illusion. No doubt, disciplines, as I have already said, have a lot to learn from each other and have to change their borders according to their interests. The world is not neatly separated into areas of disciplinary specialization. More disciplines than one are claiming good results analyzing the same facts. But many interdisciplinary practices lead to the confirmation of those borders and to no advances in scientific thinking. The work on ethnic phenomena is a good example. In many cases, the problem is how to identify one or more human beings as belonging to an ethnic identity. This results in a big number of papers written by archaeologists and geneticists who claim to do that. However, many leading population geneticists and anthropologists believe that it is not possible to do that because genetic variability inside the imagined groups is greater than that among them, just as cultural variability. There are archaeologists who believe that ethnic identification is possible only in very special circumstances with the help of the written sources, and other archaeologists who believe it is not possible at all. This shows that the researchers involved in such interdisciplinary projects do not represent their entire disciplines, but areas in which skepticism about ethnic identification does not exist. They work by taking the notion of ethnic group as a common ground, although it is impossible to construct such a notion either by geneticists or archaeologists. Geneticists can construct genetic populations and archaeologists can construct archaeological culture or groups of artifacts and other associated material facts, but these are not ethnic groups. They can be assigned to them only if there are theories allowing to do that. Specific gene associations or specific artifacts. In every discipline, the objects of study, the data, the facts are constructed. We do not examine ethnic groups as they are, but as they can be imagined by the discipline studying them. And that imagination is limited to what is considered relevant by the researchers. In the case of interdisciplinary pursuits, one might expect that two disciplines which deal with such different facts as molecular biology and archaeology, with very specific research objects, much time will be spent on constructing a common research object that will be satisfying for both archaeologists and geneticists, something indeed very difficult to do. But in those, but in the researchers of this kind, I have read not more than 10, there is no such effort. The common object is taken from common knowledge, where everyone knows what's an ethnic group. And that common knowledge comes from the realities of compulsory education and mass media. That is, they are politicized. There is no interdisciplinarity here. There is only readiness to accept past and current concerns of nation states as reality making. One could expect from the collaboration of archaeologists with molecular biologists a clash between their understandings of typology, a method particularly relevant for the study of ethnic phenomena. But biologists, from whom archaeologists have borrowed typology in the 19th century, have preserved it only for classificatory purposes, not for analysis, starting with the 1950s. Many archaeologists continue to reduce the variety of their artifacts to types, while biologists are now thinking in terms of populations, not of types. Ernst Mayr, one of the most influential biologists of the 20th century, gave a lot of importance to the difference between these two ways of thinking. I quote, "The ultimate conclusions of the population thinker and of the typologist are precisely the opposite. For the typologist, the type, eidos, is real and the variation an illusion, while the population, for the population is a type, is an abstraction, and only variation is real. No two ways of looking at nature could be more different," end of quote. The consequences for understanding ethnic phenomena are crucial. Ernst Mayr states, quote, "No two individuals are the same in sexually reproducing organisms, and consequently, no two aggregates of individuals can be the same." That could put an end to an enthusiasm, to the enthusiasm of archaeologists for ethnic grouping, but only if one of the most enthusiastic supporters of interdisciplinarity would come true. Christian Christiansen, in a paper published in 2014 titled "Towards a New Paradigm, the Third Science Revolution and its Possible Consequences in Archaeology," links fundamental changes in archaeological science-based knowledge and the increasing application of big data to necessary changes in archaeological methods, interpretations, and theory. Well, he thinks it will happen. But this way of putting things shows a hidden reality. No scientist will describe his research as science-based. Only non-scientific pursuits are likely to do that. That explains why the revolution Christiansen expects, a deep transformation of archaeological methods, interpretations, and theory, does not happen. Instead, we have more attempts to make archaeology scientific by use of scientific results, something, as it is generally known, David Clark, one of the main promoters of scientific thinking in archaeology during the 1960s, warned against. I quote from him, "Scientific aids are no more make archaeology a science than a wooden leg makes a man into a tree." The unprecedented reliance of archaeology on interdisciplinarity for the advancement of knowledge is worrying. Its autonomy was limited before that, and the current orientation towards genetics, physics, and chemistry only enhances the impact of the political. Not only because such research includes political views about the objects of study, but also because now we need expensive labs and analysis, not just expensive excavations. And in Romania, like in many other countries, almost all funding for systematic excavations is done by state institutions or by private institutions with political goals. It is significant that the chosen scientific aids require from the archaeologists something that in Romania is not included in their education, because all such aids rely on statistical analysis of the data. One could wonder why archaeologists choose genetics, which cannot say anything about artifacts and their meanings, and not something much more useful and much less expensive, art history, for instance, where the uniformities described as styles are intensively studied. Why are the archaeologists not studying nonverbal communication, something they assume artifacts do? Perhaps because that would involve changes in their ways of thinking, and that would threaten the connections with what everybody thinks, that is, the connections with the political. A paradoxical outcome of such interdisciplinary practices is that they preserved unchallenged archaeological ways of thinking, thus preserving disciplinarity. It is instructive to look at how other disciplines relate to interdisciplinarity. In a paper published in 2006, Michael Moran, a political scientist, is far from relying on interdisciplinarity for the progress of knowledge in his discipline. He examines interdisciplinarity. He says about it that this notion makes sense only a reaction, or as a reaction against or an attempt to unify modes of knowledge currently separated into disciplinary domains. He comes to the conclusion that interdisciplinarity is in part a response to the interests threatened by the autonomy of the disciplines. In his opinion, the political goal of a complete knowledge of the world can be achieved either by proclaiming that one discipline is better than all others. In Romania, this discipline seems to be management, or by claiming that there is some more creative way of understanding reality than any specialized discipline can provide. Any field of study that fails to establish the institutions and identity of a discipline is at risk from these two unified strategies. Risk is of being colonized by an imperialistic discipline, or of being submerged into interdisciplinarity. After describing how political science was built in the United Kingdom and the importance of the disciplines, Moran wonders how interdisciplinarity would ever have a chance of being born. His answer starts from the central role of power and hierarchy in the disciplines. Interdisciplinarity appears to him as a way to challenge them. Some of it comes from marginalized factions from marginalized functions, as legitimizing ideology for different constellations of interests. He mentions the managerial elites of the universities, the research councils which implement strategies and policies of the government. In his opinion, the disciplines might embrace interdisciplinarity because their connections with the states are no longer providing the financial support they need. He mentions, among others, geography and anthropology, which he names children of empire, even if sometimes disobedient. Archaeology can be added to them. It stopped a long time ago being a hobby for aristocrats, and the support it provided for national genealogies has lost much of its importance. The Romanian Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Culture and National Identity during the previous government, has allocated during the last 10 years an average of 5,000 euros for each of the 20 systematic excavations it has chosen to support. This is much less than the participation to interdisciplinary projects can bring, in which archaeologists have less work to do. Another recent development that indicates an increased involvement of politics in scientific research is the increased importance of credibility in the assessment of research results, even when done by peer review. This is epistemic injustice, a notion invented by a philosopher, Miranda Fricker, who uses it to designate inequalities generated by the context of knowledge reception, context which might favor some researchers, and inequalities that arise when what is commonly known and accepted by the researchers tends to reduce the possibility of formulating other views. There is nothing new here, but recent circumstances, such as the rise of precarious work, make this kind of injustice salient. Competition and cooperation are necessary for the quality of scientific research, but they are both affected when some researchers have temporary positions and others have stable ones, especially when those with stable positions can make decisions about who will have access to the temporary positions. Such situations generate contradictory reactions. The researchers with temporary positions tend to be revolted against a system which does not allow them to develop their capacities and to be grateful for the positions they get, even if they are temporary. One could argue that those who have stable positions are simply better than those with temporary ones, because getting a stable position is an outcome of a competition to which everyone has access. In some circumstances, this is true, but from what I know about the competitions for higher education and research positions in my country, it seems that access to them is a matter of cooptation, of being selected according to criteria which are not made public, rather than the outcome of a competition with explicit criteria. In the words of a famous Romanian comedian from the 1970s, the candidates expect to be examined on Wednesday and the job is given on Tuesday. This is not happening only in Romania, and it is not something recent. In his Wissenschaftsberuf, published in 1919, Max Weber wrote that the organizational principles of the universities were a fiction, and that becoming a professor was a matter of chance. He was a full professor at the age of 30, and he comments that at that time, in 1894, some of his contemporaries had undoubtedly achieved more than he did. It was a matter of chance because the personal achievements of the candidates were not decisive in the selection process. And he finds for this similarities in the political systems. He was so disappointed, I have a quote here, that he imagines a normative regularity, the law that one mediocrity in a faculty never fails to attract others. End of quote. Looking at what happens in Romania, I would change that to incompetent people never fail to attract people who are even less competent. And that because in such environments, trust and gratitude are liabilities. There is no better way to secure safety for those who make a selection than the proven incapacity of those they hire to formulate any kind of criticism. A good test of the willingness of higher education and research institutions to promote the quality of knowledge is the number of candidates for a stable position. In Romania, the average number is not greater than one. not much greater than 1, because the candidates are usually those who know they will win, and their competitors know they will have no chance. The official selection process takes 2 or 3 hours, and the main purpose is to make official a choice made much earlier. In 1992, I followed closely a competition for a junior position in the history department of the University of Arizona. 116 candidates. The selection process took 6 months. A great number of candidates shows their trust in the fairness of the selection process. A few conclusions. Most archaeologists keep their illusions of autonomy, declaring that they are not interested in politics, that they focus on the past, but they do that using contemporary concepts and representations of the social, which have strong political content. Some archaeologists recognize the presence of the political in the discipline and are willing to do good politics. For instance, by making archaeology support the good causes of the political world, the fight against inequality, for instance, or the European Union. In a recently published paper, an archaeology claims that we should leave our interest for the past aside and put forward what should be more important. He says we are first European citizens. So he argues we should focus on the construction of the European Union. We should create narratives that could help that to build the common identity, and to use what we know about nationalism and the nationalist construction of identity in order to do that. As a well-known historian, Reinhard Koselleck has argued, our task is not to forge identities. Our task is to destroy them, because they make communication among human beings difficult. Some political causes are indeed worth fighting for, but as archaeologists, we have to fight only for what we know, not for what we wish. Recognizing the legitimacy of a political goal is one thing. Taking us through what politicians say is another. There are things of wide interest about which archaeologists might have something to say, but we have to understand what the politicians are talking about from the perspectives offered by our discipline, not internalize the perspective of the politicians. We have to avoid imagining the past from the perspective of a present that is not a product of a scientific construction in which we are involved. Credibility, authority, coherence, and utility are common criteria for determining what is desirable knowledge in political and mass media discourse, but these criteria should be disabled inside scientific research traditions. An example, politicians speak a lot about tolerance and improving education. Archaeologists are also interested in such things. What could be wrong with them? Slavoj Žižek, a philosopher, has put tolerance in a new light with the following remark. I quote, okay, let's say the politicians are right about persistent gender inequalities and about tolerance. I go home and what do? I tell my wife, from now on, I am going to tolerate you, and end of quote. I do not know if using inequality to describe the current masculine domination helps. Two human beings cannot be equal simply because, like most animals, human beings are unique. Equality is possible only in some respects and some circumstances, so some other notion should be found. Improving education as a solution for our current problems and has generated mentality change is promoted mainly by politicians, because by doing this, they imply they are well educated and that our mentality should change, not theirs. Looking at this solution, we discover something troubling, identified by Robert Merton a long time ago. Who is going to do the change bringing, educating? If that will be done by the current educators, and if education can change society, why is the change not already done? Why do we still need change? If the current educators are not up to the task and are themselves in need of a change, who will educate them? And so on. Of course, not all archaeologists are equally able to examine such problems because not all traditions of archaeological research enable them to do that. Cultural historical archaeology limits its interest and competence to the past, but archaeologists educated as social scientists, for instance, those educated in the United States anthropology departments, are able to challenge the ways in which politicians define social situations. And I will end by saying that as archaeologists, we do at the same time archaeology and politics, and that we have to separate them because politics is associated with epistemic vices like arrogance, because we are recognized as having superior knowledge and superior education. Unfortunately, we tend to dominate those who do not have them, and that complicates things in matters of cultural heritage. Also, we want to be better than our colleagues, but domination risks to compromise much needed collaboration. Unfortunately, we even express our superior knowledge in archaeology as domination. We master our subject or our artifacts. Good knowledge requires humility, requires observation of a reality which is not shaped by our desires. If we want knowledge more than we want power, but the current systems of higher education and research make us look for power, we have to subordinate power to our epistemic goals inside the discipline, and to reject what is damaging for knowledge and cultivate power only if it is beneficial to research, demonstrably so. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alec. Thank you very much for this very composite, multi-dimensional presentation, exploration, actually. This was much more than a presentation. It was a discussion in its own merit. I don't think that power is avoidable, but still, now we can discuss. It's time for a discussion, an open discussion. Alex spoke first, I think, about audit culture and this new reality, new for us, for you people, younger people in the group, is the reality. For us, audit culture came to our lives sometime, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. Which goes hand in hand most of the time with metrics and metric culture. Yesterday, during the conference, I was intrigued by the presentation of one of the speakers, and I Googled him or her. And the first thing I knew was his or her Google Scholar account. The second thing I knew was my satisfaction that mine is higher. And then came everything else. Then I said, "Oh, okay, they've written some interesting stuff here. I should read this." But then that's metrics for you, metrics culture. And then, of course, I would like, if you would allow me, I would like to start the discussion from the second half of the second part of Alex's lecture. He didn't mention the term, and perhaps he doesn't approve of the term, but I thought that for some time he was speaking about precarity in archaeology and the neighboring disciplines you all junior participants in this group represent. And in the short presentations, self-presentations this morning, some of you said, well, yeah, I've been outside the field because I didn't have a job, so I was doing something else, and then now I'm doing something where I'm trying to get more qualifications to go back in or whatever. And this is something we certainly did not know when we were growing up. I never thought that I was going to be, I was never certain I was going to be a professor in my department, but I was a student in that department. But for some reason, I always felt, even when I didn't get the jobs I was applying to, I always felt that the way is straightforward. You try to, you aim somewhere and you either achieve it or not. And I participate in my life so far. I have participated in the job market of two countries, Britain and Greece, and there's some interesting comparisons there. So I would like to ask anyone, but especially our junior participants, to talk about precarity and how they think they affect the construction of knowledge in their field, not just personal experiences. Some of us have been luckier than others or whatever, but how do you feel about funding chances, funding, grant competitions all the time, and this idea of precarity? I think Anastasia has raised her hand. And Clary?
Yes, I raised my hand first because I think I have a lot of experience in precarity. So maybe...
although you have a job.
Yes, for now. Yes, I will talk about that too.
Yes, and you have a job at a very good department.
Yes.
With very nice people. Yes.
Well, okay. The conversation is, and I have to thank Professor Niculescu for his lectures because they were very inspiring and they enlightened our general knowledge on these very important topics. I think that young scholars are within an agonizing struggle to publish and participate in, to publish papers and participate in conferences because they really want to be inside academia and they don't want to lose their contact with our discipline. However, I really believe that it's not that easy, especially for our colleagues who do not have a job. And in Greece, for example, it's not easy to have a job as an archaeologist. Either you will work in excavations with some part-time contracts for about 2 or 6 months, and then you will return to unemployment. Or you will search for scholarships if you have good ideas in order to continue your research. However, even though my professors always have told me that I have good ideas, I never got a scholarship. And that really disappointed me many times because I always had to work. As a result, I had to work. And I finished my PhD under very difficult conditions because I was obliged to do 2 different jobs. So I do not, however, I think they were the best years of my life because I struggled very hard for what I wanted to succeed, and I did. And that taught me as well that, okay, when you really have a goal and you focus on this goal, you can succeed it, you can achieve it. But this is also a little bit romantic, because other people maybe are not given the chance to have a job. For example, the job I'm currently in the university, which is also precarious, but I am in a nice environment, as Professor Palazzo said before, and with people I know and with people I trust. Yes, I know. And with people I trust. So I feel safer than I used to feel when I was working in private education, in the private education system, which is a nightmare for everyone who is working there. So precarity, I think, is the biggest problem of a new scientist, and the lack of funds for in order to continue his research. And I would like to make a comment here. The criteria that all those committees keep in their minds in order to select a specific proposal are not always clear enough, or when they are clear, I think that they always give the money to candidates who, okay, they have a nice idea, but it depends on the current dominant ideas in a country. For example, I think in Greece, in archaeology, we are really focusing during the last years in rare techniques implemented in archaeology, petrography, analysis of metals, and all these new currents in our discipline. So theory, or the study of material, or the contextual analysis of the data from an excavation comes second or third, and we do not pay that much attention to the way we always knew how to work. So this is a problem, and this is why we never get the scholarships. This is, of course, one reason, but I think it's an important one. And one last comment. I'm not sure whether, if I understood well, I'm not sure whether it is a negative. It is a negative characteristic of an archaeology if he participates in politics in a more direct way. We must be humble. We must be focused on our discipline, but I think that if he has a public, and if he tells his opinion open into the public, and he has a specific point of view, a specific perspective of how a government or a political party or a new law needs to be implemented in order to make things better in archaeology or in other sciences, I think it's something good, and it proves his energetic role within the society. I mean, scientists should not be isolated.
Yes, I agree. I agree, but we should be very careful if
yes,
to make a distinction between what we know as archaeologists and as researchers, as people who are working for higher education, and what we wish as human beings, because what we know does not cover everything we wish. For instance, inequality is a bad thing. I agree. Any political force that fights against inequality does something good. The problem is whether they know what they are doing. That's the problem.
Yes, that's a problem for everyone, though.
Yes, if measures taken by politicians to reduce inequality do not, in fact, increase it. So because I am a scientist, or I imagine I am one, I cannot offer advice on something I do not know, as a scientist, I cannot mobilize archaeological knowledge about eradicating poverty, unfortunately. I can speak about poverty from an archaeological point of view, what it does to people, but how to bring the remedy today, that's, I think, something outside the discipline of archaeology. I might be wrong.
Yes, but Alec, I'm sorry, because you said this in your presentation. I suppose what you mean is that when you say that an archaeologist is a politician, is involved with politics, is involved in politics as an archaeologist. So
Yes.
when you and I, or like we did yesterday, or we're doing now, we have this workshop which talks about political involvement, or the perils of nationalism in archaeology, or the bad, and because you alluded to this, the misuse of archaeogenetics in archaeology. This is something that me, as an archaeologist in Greece, I think is my duty to put forward politically, to discourage research on ancient DNA that would prove that the Mycenaeans were Greeks or the Minoans were Greeks. I would call this out as bad scholarship, and I would call this out as bad politics, because it installs a racial and racist break within the fabric of the population of the country right now, because it constructs a Greece that is meant to be for the Greeks and not everybody else living here. So, okay, this is political, and perhaps of course I was not trained to do this, and perhaps I might be not very good at it, but it is my duty to do this. I think as an academic and as a professor and as a scholar, as a scientist.
Yeah.
So I think
I completely agree.
Yeah. I mean, now, if I want to become mayor in my town, or if I want to be prime minister, that's another thing. You know, it's it's. But as scholars, I think that's the idea, that we need to discuss, to highlight the political consequences of our work. I think Clary and Paulina and Bettina, and also think of how your research has been affected by audit culture and selection processes.
So I totally agree with what Anastasia said, but the thing is that, for example, Anastasia can find a job. It's difficult, but she can do it because she's, for example, an archaeologist. So I think another issue in Greece nowadays is the fact that if you don't have a monolithic path, academic path, it's difficult to find a job, because there is not such a job for someone with not just one field. For example, I can't define myself. They always ask me, are you an archaeologist? I'm not an archaeologist. I can't say that I am a museologist, because in Greece, if you are not, if your bachelor is not in archaeology, you can't find a job in a museum. Yeah, you can take a scholarship, for example, but it's not that you can find a job. So since you were in high school or even in primary school, you get to choose something that it will lead you to a path that at the end will get you a job. So this story goes far behind. And in order to do what you want or to study what you want, you have to avoid everything, and all the people that they're gonna tell you you won't get a job or you won't get funding. This is the only way to do your thing and to stay in the field that you want to.
Paulina?
Yes, well, my story is
And
a little bit.
if would people lower your hands, I mean, your yellow hands, because then it becomes confusing once you've spoken it. Paulina, sorry.
Yes, well, my story is a little bit different because as you know already, I know both worlds, the political one and the research one, and I decided to be an archaeologist when I was 6 years old. My parents remember exactly this declaration, and I never planned of doing anything else. But when I started my studies, it was mid-90s in Poland, and I was actually the first academic year where the limits of which department could accept a certain amount of students were lifted. It was up to the department to decide how many students they wanted to have. And since it was the time where huge preventive research started in Poland with the first European funding and big investments started, so the academics at universities thought that they will just take in more students, so they will have free labor for work as part of the curriculum as their field practices. This was a general practice for a number of years. It's not anymore, but this was the practice. So in the effect, except of having normally they would accept, I don't know, 10, 15 students a year at Warsaw University. My year, we started at 120. So obviously, 95% of us at the starting point didn't stand a chance of staying in and, you know, of keeping a job, getting a job in archaeology. There were just too many of them. And we were considered to be free labor. No one ever planned to pay us. So
excuse me, this was at undergraduate level or graduate level?
This was when I started. Back then there was one 5-year master degree study, so I had to get in for like the undergraduate and graduate in one. It was a 5-year process. Okay.
So that went from 10 to 100.
Yeah, more, well, maybe not 10, maybe 15, 20 to more than 100. So, and it wasn't only the case of archaeology. On many institutions thought that if they accept more students, because they were also the financial system for universities changed. So the more students they had, the more money they would get for the department, the more they could make, and so on and so on. So this is how it worked. And when I graduated as number one in my year, I graduated with merit. During the studies, I did receive one scholarship from the ministry, but this was not enough to support myself. It was rather like pocket money or something. I tried to work. I got in touch on my own with INRAP in France, so I went several times to do excavations in France and so on. But in 2000, when I got my master's, there was no job for archaeologists. No one offered me because it's also this small community with academics. They didn't want to get anyone into their circle that could change anything for good. We were good while we were students, but not necessarily important afterwards. So so I decided, it was a deliberate decision, that I will try to raise my skills in something that they don't have and they might need. So I've started to work for different foundations that assign grants. I learned about project management, which was new story, about funding, about the whole processes, how it's organized, and so on and so on. Because I thought that maybe in a few years' time, they'll just come back to me thinking that they need this, set of skills for the work. And it did happen, it did work, but by the time they did get back to me, I wasn't interested anymore. I was doing different things. So I wouldn't blame everything on politicians or the way the funding is organized or something else, because it's also within the people inside academia a lot of times, that there is really no system how to pass on the skills, how to pass on responsibility, how to this master apprentice model, a very old model, works until the apprentice is the apprentice. This is my point, I think. But if he becomes a peer, it doesn't necessarily work anymore. So this is how I see this problem.
Thank you. Let's go to Bettina.
Yes, so I realize this is going to sound like sort of special pleading, because the perception probably is that anybody who is looking for an archaeological position in the US, by definition, it's so enormous. There's so many universities, it must not be that difficult. But actually, it really depends on the particular specialty that you have. And as someone working in Europe, I can tell you that your odds of ever actually seeing a job advertised specifically with that specialty in mind is virtually zero. I, in fact, never have. So you're competing with all the other old world archaeologists out there. People definitely working in the Americas were much more likely to get jobs, and obviously also were more likely to be able to get positions in CRM, cultural resource management. In my situation, coming out of what should have been a degree program that would have given me opportunities, there was literally nothing. Some of this was timing. The early 90s were a really bad time. There were no jobs available. So even if you were, literally the best person on the planet in particular sort of area of research, it wouldn't have made any difference. But even without that, trying to create opportunities for yourself in those conditions was really difficult. So effectively what happens is that you get used to being able to teach and claim to be able to teach, claim expertise in areas that are totally unrelated to what you got your degree in. So my first position was at a community college, which is a 2-year degree here in the United States. And I taught 2 courses in women in cross-cultural perspectives and human evolution, neither of which was obviously in my wheelhouse. And that led directly, because at that point I had little teaching experience, to a 1-year visiting assistant professor position at another institution, which, while it wasn't a 2-year college, was close enough to it in terms of prestige. And that in turn led to a 4-year stint, again, not tenure track, at the University of Minnesota. So that's 5 years out from my degree now, or even 6, at which point, and I'd been applying consistently for tenure track jobs throughout this whole period and wasn't getting anywhere. I was very close to giving up. So it wasn't until the position that I have now opened up for the second time. I'd applied for it the year before. And I can also tell you I was the 3rd candidate. So the first 2 had other opportunities. So I have no illusions about my own special qualities having gotten me the job, this sort of idea that it's a meritocracy. A lot of it really is just being in the right place at the right time. And most importantly, what the message for me from all of this, and what I would communicate, I guess, to junior faculty, and actually Paulina just said more or less the same thing, acquiring some other kind of skill set which differentiates you is hugely important. And what I in my case, it was literally the emphasis not on Iron Age Europe, which nobody was interested in terms of the positions I was applying to, but the history of archaeology and the manipulation of archaeology for political purposes. Yeah. That's why I ended up getting an academic job. And I can say that my advisor, when I first published on that subject, had actually told me he thought it was a bad idea politically, because I would never be able to work in Germany again. Fortunately, I didn't listen to him because otherwise I would literally not have had an academic career. So yeah, you need to take into consideration the sort of very circuitous trajectory that a lot of people end up taking to the positions they have now, which are not always obvious when you sort of look at their CVs once they're senior or established.
Well, somebody already said this and you repeated it. We do need to listen, but not to actually listen what people are telling us to do, because usually it's the wrong thing. Ivo has put up in the chat the anthropological career in Europe precarity report. I was shocked 2 years ago when I wrote one like that for Greece. I was asked by Archaeological Reports to do one for Greece, and I was shocked to find out that right now in Greece there is 1,500 people working in archaeology, including myself. So it's shocking. And some of the contracts are, Anastasia said a few months. Some of the contracts are for a few days, 3-day contract, 2-day contract. Let's move on with Natalia and then Zenta.
Well, I won't repeat what others said. I just want to thank Anastasia for raising the question of precarity, and Ivo for sharing this, because that is really a big problem in archaeology and related sciences. For example, I suppose that everyone are following topics like tortures, truths of PhD life and everything. Me myself have and still have the path of PhD, writing PhD like Anastasia had to do, and I'm doing the job which has little to nothing with my PhD thesis, which is really hard. And you have to, I don't know, develop different kind of skills and resilience to stay on the path and follow the goal. Also, I would like to mention there are a lot of topics and papers written about it, the problem with PhD mental illness, which I'm just thinking about in that environment, what kind of knowledge you can produce. And following the ending of your PhD, you're more or less left with hunting some postdoc, which also leaves you with 2 years, 3 years of engagement at some research. So the current state of the research life is really hard. And I think that leaves you with some existential crisis, which is perpetual in a way. And I don't know, I would like to hear more thoughts about this, because as I hear, most of us are facing this kind of, I don't know, fears and thoughts, just that.
No, that's true, Natalia. Although some of what you are describing, I mean, all of the previous the persons who spoke previously, some of that is common to any generation, my generation. But there are some other bits, some other facets of this agonizing procedure that are new, that did not exist, because I think something has changed in our discipline and in our field as researchers, as academics. And audit culture might be one aspect, but there's more, and perhaps the politicization of archaeology is another. Let's hear from Zenta, and then it's Cosme. I think it's the same. Could it be? Is it perhaps a problem with your headset?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, my experience with the jobs in archaeology in Latvia is that we also have a very, very small circle. It's like a very exclusive. And when you like wanted to aim for the big positions, it's like with the Pope of Rome, someone must die in order you have a job. And that's how they change. Well, I am very lucky also to have an academic position as a scientific assistant in the Institute of the History of Latvia. I got this position because there are now these projects and grant projects where they simply need PhD students, and this institution is like obliged to give us these jobs. So students are recruited for this institution in these projects. But the thing is, it is really, really draining these metrics and this thing, because we are asked to have only Web of Science or Scopus publications, And if you don't get them in the right time or something like that, then you don't have salary. And that's the biggest issue that gives people like really mental health problems, that you always have to run for those journals, for those publications. And also the thing is that we don't have such journals in Latvia. If you have to try to find another journals, because none of our archaeological journals are in those databases that we are asked from our university to have. So yeah, I can really relate with this problem with metrics. Yeah.
Cosmin?
Yes, thank you. There are so many issues. I maybe will speak about some of them also in the next day. So things like journal metrics and requires these requirements for a journal to be indexed somewhere has its own kind of problems and issues. I actually have a question. So I don't want to complain too much. It's just that my situation is a bit similar to many of you. So I've studied in the UK. I came back for a one-year postdoc now in Romania, and I kind of discovered what I already knew actually, and what Professor Alex Niculescu said is that the positions are already taken, already given. So my very naive question to Professor Niculescu, maybe especially because he brought this subject up, is why actually is the system in our region in such a way? Why there are no open competition? Why are people not encouraged to compete, and universities don't want to hire the best in their field? And the second question would be, what would be some steps to change this system, which now seems so closed, so exclusivist in a way?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand this. I have to work at this problem, and I started a few years ago. I have some ideas why, but looking at what's happening, things could be very simple. People are afraid of competition, so they do not want to open the system to anyone who might come, because anyone might be someone very bad, someone as good as they are, or someone better. And what's frightening, someone much better. So they close the system. And they recruit people who are, generally, they tend to recruit people who are worse, as I have already said. Also, you have to display some qualities. For instance, during a PhD defense in Romania, the candidate was praised for not attacking anyone, for being a nice person and having a good opinion about everything he read, and that was taken to be a good quality. To say something is wrong or something is bad, this is not advisable in such a system. Of course, there are regional differences and differences in the same university between departments. And there are good professors, I know some. But the system is not working with them, it's working against them. So they have to comply from time to time. The main problem is that people are afraid to receive competition in the department or in the institute.
Okay, I think I agree with most of what Alec just described. However, besides personal experiences or what happens in any given country, I think is a combination of two things: political volition, political reforms on the part of the government, of the political system. And in Greece, this we did have. In the 1980s, it was a major reform in university right after, during the years I was a student in my department as a student. So the old regime of the single god and sort of semi-divine status professor was abolished. And the new sort of more democratic, more meritocratic system was enforced. This brought the competitions, this brought the open competitions, the open advertisements, and this meant the end of the old chair. There was one chair in classical archaeology, one chair in prehistoric archaeology, that was abolished. So by the time I finished my studies abroad and came back to Greece, I found a job market, an academic job market working. You could see the advertisements of the new positions. You could see the criteria, and you knew why you were selected and why you were not, which was not the case in England. And while I was in England, I was sometimes successful in getting a new job because I worked in England as well. Sometimes I was not. But when you were not in those days, because that was the late 90s, people were still allowed to tell you, yeah, well, but this time we were going for a woman. It was said to me, we were looking for a woman this time. And also, you knew they were after your book because I had a contract, and so you knew of that. So that was the mark. However, so that is one part of the equation. You need the political system at play. But you also need to take your own personal responsibility. If a department is horrible, is bad, is inefficient, is because we, the professors, have made it so. And I now for more than 10 years now, or almost 15 now, I'm a professor. Okay, so I'm one of those guys. I'm the guy who now hires other professors. I'm the guy who would hire you, and it's up to me and other 29 people in my department. But it's up to us to do exactly what Alec was just describing: to be afraid of the competition, to feel threatened by the younger, more the younger, sexier scholar who's going to be better than us in teaching, stronger than us in sort of climbing up the Acropolis and doing the teaching. So it's up to us to be threatened by him or her or not, or to encourage them. So if you find a department that is, you need a legal system at play, but you also need a few people who would like to keep the department going. And this is why Alex says, well, I can see good departments and bad departments. This is not accidental. And I've been in many departments. I worked in 3 universities in Greece, and I could see how you can destroy a department simply by making wrong choices. Not because you're wrong, but because you don't want to make the right choice. The right choice is there in front of you, but you choose to go the wrong way because you're afraid of the person. Now we have Bettina, and then Paulina, and then Burak.
Yeah, just very quickly, there is an article, and I think it's in German, and unfortunately I can't remember the citation, but I'll look for it, and if I can dig it out, I'll send it around, by Heinrich Helke, who was at the University of Reading for most of his career, but obviously is German, and spent a lot of time trying to get back to Germany and applied for every academic position that was going. And when he retired, he published essentially an expose, but also a really useful comparison of the hiring practices that he had personally observed in the UK, in Germany, and in Scandinavia, I think. And it was very revealing. So I think a lot of what, we've just heard from Alec, it's not that unusual actually within some of the other European countries, not all of them. And the idea that the system is a meritocracy is pretty clearly flawed.
The old Greek system was devised by the Bavarians. It was the German system with the professor and the assistants, and then the habilitation. The whole thing was tailored, by the Germans.
Yeah, exactly.
Now it's Paulina, and then Burak.
Yeah, I just want to say two things. One is that I agree. We also had, and I think to a large extent still have the same German system with the professor and everyone going back and fully dependent on what the professor says. And actually, the one that was the promoter of my master thesis, he was actually proud that he didn't produce any doctors, or that it took, additional 5 to 7 years to write a master thesis with him, and so on and so on. So this was a very special case. But there's one more thing which is typical, because I think it's similar probably in a lot of different disciplines. But there's one thing which is typical for archaeology, for the curriculum. I don't know if it's the specialty of Poland, probably not, that throughout my entire studies at the university, I was always taught that the only job worth doing is to become a researcher in archaeology, especially a field working archaeologist, that this was the only worthy thing I could do in my life. Everything else would be a defeat. So if you chose a job in heritage management and heritage policy at a museum, that would be a defeat, something worse than working as a researcher. So not only we were not prepared, for example, my husband who studied journalism, one of the most difficult things he had to learn during his studies was the entire legislation related to how press works. In my case, we had a 1 semester course which was not obligatory on the legal aspects of archaeology. And we, ended up with a master's degree having no idea what is the legal system and how archaeology is organized in our country. The same went for, I don't know, some practical museum work and stuff like that. So first of all, we had no idea that there are other options where where archaeologists could be needed. And secondly, being taught and brainwashed that only research work is something valuable, we ended up on this open labor market when they told us exactly the opposite thing, that this degree that you have is completely worthless. I mean, why did you even, bother doing it for 5 years? I remember when at some point when I applied for a job and I said I'm an archaeologist, and they told me, but we don't have an office in Egypt. So, what do you want to do? So I think it's another thing that those people who get into archaeology, they don't really have an idea what things they could do and where their skills could be useful. And now, looking from a perspective of a person with 20 years experience in heritage policymaking, it's very often that we look for people who can combine these different types of skills, what Bettina just told. And it's very difficult to find them because it was very, very narrow system of educating. That's at least that's my experience.
Well, wherever you look, I don't think you will find a generation that made it by repeating precisely what the previous generation had done. We all had to invent the field, but the field I invented for myself won't do you any good, because now it has been destroyed by us who actually made it. We're going to finish with Burak, and then we have the break before we come back for Bettina Arnold's lecture. Burak?
Thank you. I mean, this is all very interesting ideas, generating many in my mind. However, I would like to open only two of them to you up, which is the first one is Professor Niculescu's words on freedom and being free. I mean, as far as I gathered, you think we don't have the freedom, but we can be free. So I think there is always this choice that we can make, whatever the situation we are facing in academia, or about the political intervention on the academia, and which I think falls under the words of what Anastasia said at the beginning. I mean, all these hardships or all these bonds tightening up and forcing us to make, consider our choices and make them, let us discover the true power, the true intelligence, the true character of what kind of a researcher or scholar we want to be, starting from the topic you choose to study, rather than a professor giving you study the ceramics, but you may go further for such topics like the political intervention on archaeology, etc. The first thing I would like to say was that. The second thing I would like to share with you is my own experience about the research assistant position I hold at METÜ, Ankara, which was a result of a political intervention of the AKP government, which is on power like more than 20 years now, who has the Islamic and nationalist tendencies. As academic sphere was considered Kemalist and a Republican, and they wanted to interfere with this. I had this job, research assistant position, with a centralized attainment rather than an interview, because by this way the Central Higher Education Board was used to let the AKP spheres into the academia, which I'm actually not very close to, obviously. However, then that as they saw the program didn't work for them this way, the program was shut down or changed a bit. I don't know what's going on about that in detail. However, I would like, this is a very interesting and a peculiar example of the political intervention on academia and archaeology. I wanted to share this with you, as you might like to know things in Turkey. Thank you.
Well, I think every Balkan country has been through that phase, even if now is gone, is ended in many countries like Greece, for example. We've been through that, especially in the years after the junta. The law, the first law, that law, the 1982 law, prescribed that the candidates for the position of university had to be of democratic values, whatever that meant. And in some cases, this meant that you had to be known, a known supporter of this party and not another party. They meant not a pro, a junta sympathizer. In 82, this meant not to be a junta sympathizer, but then in 92, it may have meant different things. And we'll finish with a closing statement by Alec.
Yeah, not exactly a closing statement, a comment on liberty. Of course, we are free to do some things, but we do not choose the conditions in which we are free to do those things. So our freedom is limited. This is something very old. It comes from Marx. We can do anything we want, but in conditions which are not of our choosing. So that is a problem. University, instead of focusing on the job market, should focus on our ability, on its capacity to teach people how to reformulate their condition, not to take what is given as reality, because this is not reality. We all suffer from the impact of some decisions, but we have limited capacity to understand why those decisions are taken, to analyze the sources, to make a scientific analysis of precarity. We all suffer from it. I was a precarious professor at university for 40 years, so I have a very long experience of that. But for us, because we want to have access to good knowledge, to good quality, we have to understand why this is happening. And that's a very difficult effort. We don't have the training to do that. And in our countries, we have another problem. The best ways of looking at such things come from American sociologists of knowledge like Robert Merton, or French sociologists of knowledge like Gheorghe, but they have studied in their places. Merton in the United States, Bourdieu in France. No one studied Romania and what's happening in Romania. And it's not the same thing. So if you read the sociology of knowledge and look what's happening around you, you say, well, I'm doing something different. This is not knowledge what I'm doing here. So what kind of institution is that? What kind of environment? So you have to devise your own means of understanding what's happening, and that's very difficult if you have no training for that. I have no training for that.
And I think we all need to own up to our responsibilities. The responsibilities that come with the job, that come with the discipline, come with what we're doing in our professional life at the moment. Okay, now time for a break, shorter than advertised, but still enough, I think. It's in 35 minutes, we're resuming, a quarter past the hour, whatever the hour is, well, in your time zone, the time zone you're at the moment. So that let's meet at a quarter past the hour for Bettina Arnold's lecture. Thank you very much for this excellent discussion. See you all in a bit. Please, everybody, take note of the articles and PDFs advertised in the chat. I think they're very useful. Now we're going to head with the first of two lectures offered to our program by Professor Bettina Arnold. The first one is titled "The Relationship Between Archaeology and Politics, Still Faustian, but Not Much of a Bargain." Sounds intriguing, to say the least. It is a great pleasure to have Professor Arnold in this program. We're extremely grateful, if only for the sacrifices he has made to her sleep arrangements for all this, to compromise the time zone difference. Professor Arnold has had the opportunity to talk about her life, her career in life a bit already. She's a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and she has a PhD in anthropology from Harvard and a BA in archaeology from Yale. She, as she has already mentioned, she's an expert in the pre-Roman European Iron Age. But as she also has mentioned, in the course of her career, she has participated in archaeological projects ranging from the Middle Bronze Age through the early medieval period in Western Europe. She has worked on many different areas: archaeological interpretation and analysis of complex societies, material culture as a symbolic system and a means of communicating social relationship, the archaeological interpretation of prehistoric gender configurations in imperial contexts, and the socio-political history of archaeology and museum collecting, especially their involvement in identity construction in 19th and 20th century nationalist and ethnic movements in Europe and the United States, which is the primary reason why she's with us this afternoon. She's still read, if only for her seminal article from 1990 in Antiquity on the use and abuse of archaeology for political purposes in Nazi Germany, a subject that has recently reacquired new strength, I think, and attracted renewed interest. So, Professor Arnold, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting to be with us this evening, and thank you for doing this. We're ready for you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to try to do screen share now, and hopefully this will actually work. Can everybody see that? Yes, good. Okay. So some of the specific points that I'll be making in this presentation actually pick up on a number of things that were already discussed in Alex's really excellent excursus earlier today, and also in the discussion. So I'm expecting we'll have a little bit of overlap, but there'll maybe be some additional and slightly different takes on some of the topics that we've covered. What I'd like to propose today is that we're seeing a paradigm shift in the symbiotic relationship between archaeology and politics, particularly when you consider the very close relationship that existed between these two ways of thought, essentially, since the 19th century, when the rising tide of nationalism and the development of archaeology as a profession first combined in a mutually enabling synergy. In the 21st century, I argue, archaeology still has its uses as political capital, and in some areas of the world, that use or that abuse of archaeological research continues to take the traditional form. But I would argue that in other places in the world, nation states are gradually divesting themselves of responsibility for cultural patrimony within their geopolitical borders. And it's being replaced increasingly by a privatization of archaeological contexts of various kinds that include sites, but also to some extent other types of monuments. A new kind of identity politics consisting of special interest groups, both supranational, such as the EU, and subnational or intranational, such as indigenous or regional organizations, is on the rise in a number of areas of the world. What has been called small n or soft nationalism is in some places replacing traditional nation-state co-option of the past, as archaeology is increasingly viewed either as a drain on resources or as a source of economic rather than political capital. While financial support of archaeological research by governments has been waning in those areas, co-option of archaeological data by special interest groups remains strong. The shifting political ground has major implications for the future of our profession. The trends I outline in this presentation are especially clearly illustrated by an archaeological site complex in Germany that has been my main research focus since the 1990s. As the second field season of excavations, my colleague Matthew Murray and I carried out near the Iron Age Hoyneboog Hill Fort on the Upper Danube River came to a close in the summer of 2000. We witnessed a watershed moment in the history of the site. Local politicians and administrators of the State Monuments Office of Baden-Württemberg gave speeches, and members of the local historical society drank toasts and applauded as the metaphorical keys to the site were handed to the local community. With that gesture, the state divested itself of direct management of a major archaeological monument in Iron Age Central European scholarship. Fast forward to December 2012, when a special session of the local council in Haberting and Hundersingen determined that given an annual net loss of more than 150,000 euros, the museum would be shuttered as of October 2013, unless the state agreed to support its upkeep. The irony of the timing of this announcement was not lost on local media. 2012 had been dubbed the, quote, Year of the Celts in Baden-Württemberg, featuring a series of statewide coordinated exhibits and events related to Iron Age archaeological finds, including a blockbuster exhibition in Stuttgart entitled Die Welt der Kelten, Zentren der Macht, Kostbarkeiten der Kunst. In the midst of this media campaign focusing on Celtic archaeology, the arguably most famous and significant archaeological site of the early Iron Age in the state of Baden-Württemberg, if not in Germany, was about to declare bankruptcy and close its doors to the public. As recently as 2008, state archaeologists and political figures had attended a meeting at which the Heuneburg was discussed as a possible candidate for nomination to the UNESCO World Heritage List. Yet only 4 years later, the local community was holding the site hostage in an attempt to extract state aid for its maintenance. The opposition party, at that time the CDU, pointed out that after spending more than €1 million on the excavation and restoration of an 80-ton central burial chamber, billed as the star attraction of the exhibit in Stuttgart in September 2012, it was unconscionable to expect the local community to pay for the upkeep of the Hill Fort and museum without state support. Here's the quote from the local paper. The CDU-Fraktion, this is now, I'll read it in German first and then I'll attempt to translate it, site translate it. Die CDU-Fraktion hat die Landesregierung aufgefordert, die Gemeinde Herbertingen beim Betrieb des Freilichtmuseums Heuneburg zu unterstützen. Es kann nicht sein, dass sich das Land damit begnügt, die Kelten in der Landeshauptstadt zu würdigen, die Gemeinde, die die Fundstelle beheimatet, aber mit allen dazugehörigen Herausforderungen allein zu lassen, hieß es in einer Mitteilung der Fraktion. Basically, the argument here is that given the amount of money that had been spent on the exhibition in Stuttgart, it was simply inconceivable that there would be this neglect essentially of this very important site and that it would be effectively left to fend for itself. The extent of the changes in state funding levels for archaeological research and site management in several EU states and the declining political significance of such cultural patrimony are evident when levels of support for the Heuneburg in previous decades are compared to the 2013 crisis. The peak period of political co-option of the Heuneburg Hill Fort and its associated mortuary landscape is of course represented by the excavation of the Homichele burial mound in the late 1930s, one of the largest tumuli in Europe. Gustav Rieck of the SS Ahnenerbe and Hans Reinhardt of the Rosenberg office had competed for access to the mound, which was viewed as a desirable excavation target since the 19th century, when investigations in nearby tumuli uncovered graves containing gold neck rings and metal drinking vessels that were compared by antiquarian Eduard Paulus the Younger to the shaft graves of Mycenae. Even today, the site is often referred to, and this is the Heuneburg and its environs, so not just the Homichele, in the regional press, only semi-ironically, as the Swabian Troy. And the reason I juxtapose these two is because, of course, the co-option of archaeological research by National Socialism, which I'm sure we'll be hearing quite a bit more about in tomorrow's presentation by Susanne, is a classic case of capital and nationalism. And what we're seeing now is essentially a shift away from support by the state of this type of research, as its utility for that particular purpose has also been declining. At least that's one possible way of interpreting the situation that exists at the moment. In general, in this particular region of Germany, but in Germany as a whole, I would argue the degree of public interest in archaeology is actually quite high, which is a direct legacy in the case of the Heuneburg area, not only of the Homichele project, but of almost a quarter century of excavations at the Hill Fort after World War II. Between 1945 and 2000, excavations at the Heuneburg and its environs were funded by the state as well as the local community, even in the first post-war decades when there was relatively little money available. In his 1983 guide to the Heuneburg and its excavation history, Wolfgang Kimmig particularly noted the support provided for the archaeological investigations carried on the Hill Fort Plateau between 1963 and 1970 by the National Funding Agency, DFG, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, as well as the state of Baden-Württemberg through its monument main office and the Tübingen branch office. Numerous local businesses supported the project. Hundreds of local people were hired as excavation crew members over the years. and a local organization dedicated to the preservation and investigation of the site, the Hoineburg Museumsverein, received a state-funded archaeology prize in 1985 for its museological and pedagogical activities, including the creation of an archaeological hiking trail and a museum in a renovated tithing barn in Hundasingen, shown here. The recreation of a section of the mud brick wall fortification system and several buildings on the plateau in the late 1990s was accompanied by archaeologically informed pedagogical programming that set high standards for community and academic partnerships. Unfortunately, this fruitful cooperative relationship began to unravel with the transfer of control of the site from the state to the local community in 2000, culminating in a legal dispute that led to the eventual departure of the museum's then director of archaeological programming. Under German law, the site now cannot hire an archaeologist that is trained as an archaeologist in a comparable position, and the current financial struggles of the museum and the site complex as a whole are at least partly a reflection of this shift from an academically and pedagogically focused to a largely commercial enterprise. And this is one of the themes that I'd like to engage with further in the paper and also in our discussion today. This illustrates one of the problems of developing such facilities when there's no accompanying state commitment to establishing and maintaining rigorous scholarly standards for upkeep and programming. Visitors to the Hoineburg until the late 1990s might have found little signage and no reconstructions of houses or fortifications, but they had free access to the plateau and the view across the Danube plain. There's now a fence around the entire hilltop, and without personnel to man the entrance to the museum, again, unless the museum is kept open, any future visitors or current visitors, as well as locals, would become the innocent victims of a perfect storm of economic decline, poor administrative decision-making by the local authorities, and the lack of political will on the state level to take responsibility for its cultural patrimony. Fortunately, the adoption of a new business model made the site accessible to visitors again in late 2013. So this shuttering of the entire Hillfort Plateau was not a permanent situation. On June 18th of that year, of 2013, a 3-year agreement was signed between the Gesellschaft für Archäologie in Württemberg und Hohenzollern, the largest archaeological organization in Southwest Germany, and the Hoineburg Museumsverein, which jointly administered the site with some state support until last year, when it changed hands yet again. And I'll be talking a bit more about that later. So there was an extension of that original 3-year contract. While there's no doubt that the creation of the EU has changed the political as well as economic landscape of Europe in ways that have had unexpected consequences for state funding of archaeological research, I don't want to give the impression here that all of those changes have been negative. The nomination of 111 Circumalpine Neolithic and Bronze Age pile dwelling locations as a World Heritage Site complex in 2011 is a good example. 5 European nation states cooperated in drawing up and submitting this nomination, which had to be drafted in English to meet the UNESCO requirements: Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Italy, and Slovenia. This type of transnational agreement would have been unthinkable in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and yet it's not the first multi-site, multi-country nomination to be submitted and approved in recent years. If the thesis that state funding for archaeological investigation and preservation is largely determined by expedience, and this is my primary thesis, is correct, then what I think we're seeing is a shift in the use of the past in identity politics, again, from the state as the primary sort of consumer of archaeological data and research, consumer and exploiter, I would argue, to the supra or sub-state level context where the nation state is no longer the primary signifier of identity. I suggest that this shift may be partially responsible for the significant reduction in state funding for archaeological research and site preservation, with responsibility being transferred either to the local community, which is often not equipped to deal with it either financially or in terms of adequately trained personnel, or to pan-regional or global funding agencies like UNESCO, whose requirements are not logistically within the reach of most agencies, such as historical societies or similar organizations. This trend has obvious ramifications for archaeological praxis. On the one hand, the fact that overt political manipulation of the archaeological past in the big N nationalism state-level context has declined, at least in Western Europe in the last 2 decades, is a welcome development. On the other hand, the concomitant and increasing neglect and or divestiture of archaeological patrimony by the state should be cause for deep concern, particularly when coupled with continuing widespread development and an increasing shift from limited research design-driven archaeological investigations to CRM or cultural rescue types of rescue archaeology or cultural resource management archaeology as the main form of fieldwork and the primary source of data. An especially disturbing case was represented by the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which in 2013 announced a reduction in archaeological excavation and preservation funding from an average of 12 million euros per year to 3.3 million euros per year in 2014 to 0 by 2015. The impact on the archaeological record of a densely populated state where the large-scale mining of brown coal continues unabated obviously would be devastating in the absence of archaeological investigation and monitoring. The silent destruction of sites on a vast scale is just one of the problems resulting from such austerity measures. Maintaining, restoring, and analyzing already excavated finds in state collections would also be jeopardized. The title of an article at the time, in German again, Wenn das Schule macht, if this catches on, was juxtaposed by the conclusion, anderswo geht's auch anders, as the authors pointed out that the situation in France, just across the border, in other words, was very different, with a much greater degree of state support for archaeological resource management and excavation, in spite of equivalent economic constraints. Now, some of this was obviously the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis, and things have improved slightly in many of these contexts. But I would argue that the primary problem exists and will continue to exist in some form. In response to this particular archaeological context in Rheinland-Westfalen, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Ur- und Frühgeschichte circulated a petition from March 24th through June 23rd of 2013, asking archaeologists as well as members of the public to sign and provide feedback regarding the proposed budget cuts. By the June 23rd end date, 27,000 people had signed the petition, including more than 13,000 citizens of the affected state, the largest collection of signatures ever gathered in Germany protesting budget cuts to heritage preservation. So at the extreme end of this spectrum in Western Europe, the situation in Italy, which I'll just briefly outline here, represents what the future may hold for many, if not most nations, where austerity measures have gone beyond state divestiture of fiscal responsibility for heritage to the actual flogging or selling of cultural patrimony, including sites and objects of historical or archaeological significance. Italy is home to much of the European cultural heritage, including artistic, archaeological, architectural, and environmental heritage. Articles 7 and 22, now 33, introduced in the Financial Act of 2002 by the Italian government at the time, are privatizing part of it. Already objects from the medieval period to the 20th century have been sold to international investment firms and private investors for amounts that many Italian experts consider well below median market prices. Not to mention the fact that you can make the argument cultural patrimony on this scale should not be sold by the state in any case. Hundreds of other objects, among them temples, old cities, medieval palazzos, archaeological sites, museums, beaches, and islands, are still waiting to be sold. This is not only an ongoing source of division in Italian politics, but is also the subject of heated public debate. It highlights crucial social and cultural problems relating to global privatization that the world community will have to face in the coming years. The pandemic, with its devastating impact on heritage tourism, will surely accelerate this troubling trend, and archaeologists must be more proactive than they have been in countering such destructive and short-sighted, politically motivated economic measures. The field will literally have no future unless an active defense can be developed against liquidation schemes of this predatory kind. One of the ways to do this is to identify and expose the funding trail for individual cases so that the public is made aware of the cannibalistic nature and culturally destructive ramifications of privatization. Unfortunately, the developments I've outlined so far are not evidence that archaeological research has become a neutral form of cultural patrimony. On the contrary, in those areas of the world where claims over territory continue to be contentious, the political manipulation of archaeological data continues unabated. Two books published in 1995 and 2007, both with Philip Cole as one of the editors, illustrate the shift in emphasis during that time. 1995 publication had the title Nationalism, Politics, and the Practice of Archaeology, and it focused mainly on European, Eurasian, and Asian nation-state nationalism and archaeological praxis. Published more than 10 years later, Selective Remembrances, Archaeological Praxis, archaeology in the construction, commemoration, and consecration of national pasts is a much more complex volume, with ethnic nationalism, that is little n nationalism, and identity politics constituting the primary thematic thread. In the intervening decade, at least in Western Europe, geopolitical changes had led to a de-emphasis on archaeological evidence as a foundational element of the state. It seems unlikely to be a coincidence that state support has waned in tandem with the political capital represented by the archaeological record. Archaeological research is now more frequently co-opted by ethnic minorities within nation states that are struggling to establish and maintain an identity separate from either the dominant culture or from other ethnic minorities. Territorial disputes are often involved in such cases, as they are in most nation-state forms of archaeological politicization. A good example from this hemisphere is the ongoing battle between the Hopi and the Navajo in the Four Corners area of the American Southwest, home to some of the most important archaeological sites in the world. The reservation boundaries for the Hopi tribe and Navajo Nation have been contested since the late 19th century, when they were first drawn by the US government. Tribal oral histories, as well as congressional decrees, have led to a series of legal battles over water rights and land use that have left the Hopi surrounded by 25,000 square miles of Navajo territory, the largest Indian reservation in the US. Prompted by the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, otherwise known as NAGPRA, in 1999, the US National Park Service ruled that the Navajo, along with 18 modern-day Pueblo tribes, had ancestral affiliation to various prehistoric sites in the Four Corners region, including Chaco Canyon, which borders the Navajo Reservation and is on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And you can see it in the slide here. Now, just a brief point here. The Navajo are linguistically and genetically not local. This has been shown definitively. So the fact that they now outnumber the Hopi, where you can actually determine continuity with respect to both residents and genetic and linguistic affiliation with the region, means that we have a really difficult situation with this particular sort of dynamic that's developed between these two groups. The UNESCO website description uses the terms ancestral Pueblo as well as Anasazi in an attempt to avoid appearing to come down on one side of the controversy or the other. But archaeologists working for the tribes or the National Park Service often do not have that option. And it's even worse if they happen to be native members of one or another of the two tribes in that region. If they're archaeologists actually with tribal affiliations, then it can get very politically difficult. So given this backdrop, it's easy to see how NAGPRA has become a proxy battleground for grievances that have nothing to do with burials, which is what its original intent was. After all, if a group's historic land claims are legally enshrined by the law, they could have greater standing in a court of law. Nonetheless, each tribe is maneuvering to exploit this particular law and some of the ancillary decisions that have been made in the courts since 1990 for their own advantage. For example, the Navajo Nation Historic Preservation Department recently requested that a statement acknowledging the nation's affiliation to Anasazi sites be included in official reports of research done on Navajo land. The Hopi, for their part, often put the squeeze on Southwestern archaeologists to publicly criticize the Navajo claims of links to Pueblo sites. This makes archaeologists who are still trying to repair their historically tense relations with Native Americans deeply uncomfortable, to say the least. Either way, it seems scholars get caught in the crossfire. Another example of identity politics and archaeological co-option in the service of little n nationalism is represented by a controversial attempt in 2011 by the Israeli government to privatize archaeological sites, including what's claimed to be Silwan or the City of David in Jerusalem. In 1997, the area of Silwan was given into the hands of the Elad Foundation, an extreme right-wing voluntary organization that has been criticized for dictating the focus of the excavations and the historical narratives emerging from the project in order to serve its ideological agenda. Israel has always given permission to independent registered academies, such as institutes of archaeology at international universities, to dig, analyze artifacts, and publish their results with a license from the Israeli Antiquities Authority or the National Parks Association. Independent development companies have also managed historic sites, as at Caesarea, for example. But Elad is the first private organization in Israel to fund and oversee an antiquity site inside a crowded residential Arab neighborhood, while also pursuing an ideological mandate to settle Jewish residents there as part of connecting to and promoting a particular historic era. And there's a quote from Yonatan Mizrahi. This is the most outrageous case of a political group running an archaeological site and a case study for archaeology in conflict with communities. When you bring heritage sites to political organizations, you give them political power. Archaeologists should be open-minded about which layers to preserve and show to the public and what kind of cooperation to have with the surrounding public, end quote. What all these examples have in common is a sense on the part of the funding agencies involved, whether private, state, or national, that archaeological research is worth supporting financially only if it can be shown to have direct and beneficial relevance to present concerns. And this is a problem I'm pretty sure we're going to be hearing about several times in the course of the next few days. This is illustrated by the fact that at a time when virtually all other Western European nation states were decreasing their support of archaeological research, in Scotland, just before the 2014 vote on independence from Britain, support was increasing, the only place that I was able to find in Europe, supporting the idea that there's a symbiotic link between levels of state funding for archaeology and its political utility. It seems unlikely to be a coincidence that government support of archaeology was higher in Scotland than in any other area of the UK at that time. The excavations that were carried out at the site of the Battle of Bannockburn, which Robert the Bruce won against the English in 1314, between 2011 and 2014, were motivated by the 700th anniversary of the battle and its timely correspondence with the upcoming referendum and the creation of the National Trust for Scotland's new Bannockburn Battlefield Centre, shown here. The team members were archaeologists and historians at the National Trust, the Centre for Battlefield Archaeology at Glasgow University, the Stirling Council, Stirling University, the Treasure Trove Unit, and a contract program named GUARD Limited. The financial records of Archaeology Scotland of this period clearly show an upward trend in funding between 2009 and 2014, and the same thing could be seen in the Scotland Historic Environment Audit of 2012. And it's worth noting that after 2014, when the referendum failed, that support declined again. Not only that, but this is the most recent manifestation, essentially, of the particular symbolism associated with the statue of Robert the Bruce here and the battlefield center. So obviously, the quote here from the museum is telling. This comes at a time, i.e. the vandalism here, two different forms, by the way, of little n nationalism clashing. It's the reason that I thought this was kind of a useful and interesting slide. The museum director is quoted in June of this past year. This, meaning the vandalism, comes at a time when our charity is suffering serious financial hardship, and this is a cost we could do without, i.e. cleaning it up again. As for the fate of the Heuneburg, in a flashback to 2012, the management of the hill fort and its two museums was handed over to the Baden-Württemberg State Office for Castles and Gardens in 2020. The current political leadership of Baden-Württemberg has chosen to highlight the Iron Age Celts in a media campaign entitled Keltenland Baden-Württemberg. Culture Secretary Petra Olszewski, shown here on the left, recently made the political link between past and present explicit in her description of the Celts as the first pan-European cultural community north of the Alps, with Baden-Württemberg as an exemplar of this proto-EU phenomenon. And the quote is actually in the first paragraph just below the photo of the two politicians in this particular case. Once again, interestingly, the local press has been somewhat skeptical about the funds to be lavished on this Celtic identity project, as is indicated by the headline shown here. The question mark was unfortunately cut off, but it's there. What's happening for those 10 million euros? Again, not unlike the response initially when I presented that 2012 exhibition case study. As these examples demonstrate, the Faustian bargain that has existed between archaeology and its sources of funding since its inception as a discipline is still determining what will be funded, what will be excavated, and how what is excavated will be interpreted. While the agendas behind the entities providing financial support may not always be as obviously politically motivated as the SS excavations at the Homichele, they're just as potentially damaging to the field. Many sites will not survive state divestiture, and even those that do may be negatively impacted by the need to make them pay for their maintenance. And can I just say that, part of the argument here against, lavishing funding on these very limited kinds of vanity projects is that that money is then not available for preservation or any of these other kinds of excavations that might actually advance our knowledge of what happened in these cultural contexts in the past. That's my primary objection to them. World Heritage inscription is not an option for the vast majority of archaeological sites, and even if it were, such cultural monuments face problems of their own. There will always be tension between the World Heritage Organization's aims, which are primarily, again, about preserving the integrity of a listed site or site complex, and the economic and political agendas of the local community and the state. This tension is also at the heart of the ongoing Heuneburg situation, which resembles a pass the parcel game motivated by the potential economic benefits of heritage tourism. Rather than developing a research strategy dedicated to investigating all aspects of the societies that inhabited this region in the Iron Age, state archaeologists have opted to focus on the small subset of the population buried in central chamber graves with photogenic gold objects and imports, because that has proved to be the most fruitful strategy in securing state funding. In the long term, the trends outlined here will have a permanent impact on the interpretive potential of all archaeological data, as what we can know about the past is reduced with each unrecorded and unspectacular site that is destroyed or privatized. The only thing that has not changed since the 19th and early 20th century political co-option of archaeological patrimony by nation states is that archaeologists and the cultural heritage they're professionally trained to recover, interpret, and protect are still pawns in power struggles between entities that frequently have no scholarly interest in the past apart from its utility in underwriting their political or economic agendas. As a colleague who is both an archaeologist and a journalist in Germany and was directly involved in the petition drive protesting the budget cuts in Nordrhein-Westfalen recently put it, Archäologen mucken nicht auf. Archaeologists tend not to make a fuss. This is a major problem and indicates the extent of our dependence on patronage. We will all have to get used to proactively rather than reactively pushing back, making a fuss, or making some noise, as John Lewis put it recently, against the economic and social forces that are asking us to justify our existence if the discipline is to survive, especially as archaeological research continues to lose its propaganda value for big N nationalism. Business as usual is not an option, and simply claiming that cultural heritage is innately worthy of preservation is not enough. We will need public buy-in if we're to survive, and we must be willing to articulate the value of what we do in more accessible ways while holding the line against political depredations in the name of economic expedience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this excellent exploration of a very complex problem, a very challenging situation we all find ourselves in. The sustainability red herring, or the sustainability false promise, which is never sustainable. Let's open the discussion. I'm sure there's going to be many points to be raised. Any volunteers? Who wants to go first? Susanne?
Thank you very much, Bettina. It was interesting. And I come from the history of archaeology, and now I would say after 100 years of acting like this, I would say maybe archaeology made a wrong decision when they established a mechanism. It works like this. We have a contested border, maybe after a war, and we say, let's put money into it. Let's create a regional identity for these inhabitants. Let's make excavations there. Let's put a museum there. My whole working room is full with examples for this mechanism. And I learned it in the last days. For the whole Balkans, it worked in the same way. They all behaved in the same way. They teach each other this mechanism. But I think when you are focused on a temporary political problem, you undermine, you attack the value of archaeology and of science, because you put it on an actual problem, but that will go. It will go away. The political circumstances of any archaeological site will change many times before it will completely gone. So I think it was really the wrong mechanism. And now in Germany, we have the problem we have many of these site museums, many museums, and they got a lot of money for the last 100 years. But it's now a kind of an inflation. You know, we have just too much. They all are fighting now for public money, and they don't have new ideas for communicating archaeology in the landscape. And it's really, I see a lack of modern ideas. I just see old stylish behavior, an old discourse of money crisis, of financing crisis. But I can show the money goes up since 100 years everywhere. And yes, I think it's time to develop new mechanisms and new strategies and also new ways of communication, I would say. So, but thank you very much. It was really impressive.
Yeah, thank you. No, I totally agree with you, actually. I think that the ephemeral, you know, sort of nature of a lot of the interpretations and research plans, if you can even call them that, they're reactive. And I think part of the problem there is that there's an absence of a research design. I mean, something that really does encompass the full spectrum of the societies that we're studying. That's not site specific. That's, you want to understand, you know, vertically, social organization. You want to understand horizontally, geographically, and temporally variation. Those kinds of concerns, which I'm sure most of us are interested in, are really hard to sell to funding agencies to some degree, but certainly to politicians and to some degree also to the public, to be perfectly honest. So while I agree with you, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess the question is, how can we do better at sort of shifting, you know, the lens? Because I think the fixation that we have right now on these site-specific types of context, I think, is a problem, and it's definitely part of the reason that there's this funding crisis right now. So I absolutely agree with that.
Yes, Susanna?
Just to add something, I think there would be many different ways, but it depends a bit on the temperament of all the actors. In Germany, we have, I think you all know that, this sky disk of Nebra, this Bronze Age dish, you know what I mean? Okay. Yep. The site was always known. It was checked during the GDR times, but after the discovery of that disk, it became an Goldgräberstimmung, a golden age of
gold rush.
A gold rush.
Gold rush, yeah. El Dorado.
Absolutely. And the landscape wasn't interested at all before the discovery. And then all the guys thought, okay, let's make a tourism center. Let's develop it to a tourism center. And I think that was a really new thing. Normally, it was more a political thing between site management and the regional stuff. But since the sky disk, a lot of archaeologists and a lot of politicians learned the lesson: we can generate a new tourism magnet. But no one could go every 2 years to that place. You know what I mean? You can't make it's impossible to create a real magnet. You know what I mean? So they start a mechanism to push the attention every 2 or 3 years to that place, and they left the scientific ground, I would say. The management of Sachsen-Anhalt published books about a Bronze Age empire in that region. You know what I mean? They really create it's a fantasy, it's a fairy tale, it's a fantasy land, and they start that mechanism to let it run. And I think it's really a wrong way. And now in the pandemic, we see that tourism can't pay for everything. You know what I mean? It's not constantly. And for me, it's another argument to rethink the mechanism of tourism, and just gold can't be the way to guarantee the financing for supporting monuments and for financing research. We really have to think these mechanisms.
Yep, I totally agree. So the project that I was describing, this massive recovery of central burial chamber, which was taken out en bloc and cost 1.3 million euros to sort of excavate, micro excavation by conservators. It was in a very waterlogged context, and a lot of the organic material was preserved to a degree that it was a bit unusual, but that also meant that a lot of the metal was in terrible shape, for example, and there was some uncertainty before the actual block was taken out whether or not that central chamber burial was undisturbed, because the upper portions of it was not preserved, so you couldn't actually tell. There was no evidence of anything from the side and nothing from below, because the sort of walls were still preserved to that degree. And so the dilemma there on the part of the archaeologists who received the funding was that they had to deliver the goods. 1.3 million euros worth of something pretty spectacular had to come out of that thing. One of my colleagues said, as they kept, kind of revealing one bead at a time, sort of in the news, there better be a gold floor in that chamber when they get to the bottom of it. So, but it's funny, but it's not funny, because on some level that has driven the narrative of how that site has been interpreted. And there actually is some suggestion that it was opened, probably not looted in the conventional sense, but that some things were taken out of it. And even the bare possibility that disturbance had occurred was rejected pretty much immediately because of that obligation to show that the money had not been misspent. And that's not good. That is really not good.
Okay. Although I take the point, and I certainly agree with Susanne on that, well, archaeologists have to change the agenda. I wonder if this is possible, because we did not really set the agenda to begin with. I mean, nationalism and exceptionalism was not devised by archaeology. Archaeology was invented to substantiate nationalism, exceptionalism, and banal nationalism. This is why we're here. I mean, this is why our 19th century predecessors were there, and this is a discussion we're not supposed to be making. I don't suppose our bosses in politics would really approve of this conversation undermining their policies. But of course, it's true. There needs to be a stop of some sort, especially not to stop digging new sites and then letting them rot without any provision of how they will sustain themselves, even on paper. So we have questions from Anastasia, then Ivo, and then Paulina. Anastasia.
Yes, thank you, Professor Arnold, for this interesting presentation. I have a question. It's not a comment. Okay, we know that in Germany, there was a very strong effort of proving through archaeology the Germanic origins from the prehistoric, even from the Bronze Age era, and that effort increased during the Nazi regime. However, in the USA, the situation is different, and you showed in one slide the Chaco culture in the Navajo's territory. How do the locals react when this kind of excavations take place in their land? And how does the US government support this kind of excavations because they haven't built their national identity. The Americans haven't built their national identity as we have here in Europe. I mean, it's a whole different socio-political context and frame. So how does it work there?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. And effectively, it's also the reason why archaeology is not a humanities field, it's a social science field. And comes out of anthropology, because by definition, the earliest archaeologists were all of European descent and were not studying their own past. So they were viewing whatever archaeological contexts existed before European contact, through the lens of the other, let's say. So that from the beginning, it was you know, a kind of objectification of the native peoples. That's not true anymore now to the extent that it once was. So there's been, even since I started, you know, kind of studying archaeology as an undergraduate, when there were virtually no native archaeologists, there are quite a few now. Some of that, again, paradoxically, was driven by cultural resource management needs, and because there were jobs in that sector. Because one of the things you have to consider is that, and this is true for African Americans as well as for Native Americans and other minority groups in the US, anthropology is not the first thing they're going to be drawn to, or archaeology. It's considered a vanity type of discipline here. In other words, if you were to suggest to a first generation college student that they should study this, you really need to be able to demonstrate they can make a living at it. So that was one of the first things that had to happen effectively. So the expansion of CRM excavations, especially in tribal contexts, has really made a huge difference. And so there's now been, I would say, an increase. It's certainly 300 times as many, if not more, native archaeologists than there were when I started as an archaeologist in the 1980s. That said, Chaco, by the way, it's an interesting site for a number of reasons. It's actually a desert situation, and there's no need to really do much excavating because nothing's buried. So it's stone construction above ground. And while there have been some excavations around the foundations and obviously in, you know, kind of settlement context within some of the structures, it's a difficult site to kind of compare to anything in Europe, because it clearly was not, there was a population, a very small one, that inhabited it during sort of the year, but there was no permanent occupation. It was a ritual site. They actually have no water there whatsoever. You had to bring water in. Also had to bring in fuel. So if you wanted to burn anything, you needed to bring that with you. And it's a good, you know, it's a very long way. It's at least 20 miles to the closest habitation sites that we're aware of. So it was a hugely important site. You'd have to think of it almost like a cathedral, you know, place where people would gather for very specific kinds of ceremonies. And it's that significance that makes it so contentious when it comes to the political situation that exists between the Hopi on the one hand, clearly established linguistically and genetically as local, and the Navajo on the other hand, just as clearly not established as local, but where their oral tradition does make the claim that they're local.
Okay.
So you have a tension there that from the archaeologist's point of view, it's almost impossible to resolve.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Ivo?
Thank you, and thanks again, Professor Arnold, for your very interesting lecture with so many provocative directions. What I particularly value is this focus on the shift from state and national, not only funding, but interpretation, control, everything towards different agents, and not only supranational and in terms of power and authorities, but also in different kinds of enthusiasts, and really a whole new spectrum of agents who claim actually their power on these sites. And on the other hand, I also would like to point out that at least from the Bulgarian and some Balkan contexts, we have to pay attention also to the agency of national agents and authorities who are still there. And in this sense, I'm more of Latour's supporter, that we have some strange mixture and collective between national or local authorities and new supranational agents, and that we observe that actually in many heritage sites all over the world, and these are like recent reports, but also in terms of economic how to say monopolization maybe of what is happening. And from Bulgarian context, we see, I mean, the realization of such mixture, something, I mean, we tend to see neoliberal contextualization and privatization of heritage in terms of total privatization of new business sectors. But what we see in Bulgaria recently, what we'll be seeing is this strange mixture between the state and the new economic actors who are acting together, and that reinterprets what we value, what kind of heritage is preserved or protected or restored. And just to illustrate that thought, I mean, we've seen how these new collectives who are taking place through EU funding also, and that was the point also that you made towards interpreting everything as tourism, as tourist attraction, and that had a great influence here in Bulgaria. So this new collective resulted in promoting heritage sites which do not specifically belong to the authorized discourse of the nation, which has been done during socialism and afterwards. But that this new collective, they've chosen new heritage sites which were ready for restoration. And that was the main reason which actually has been put in advance. Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's actually really useful to know, because it supports the idea. I'm beginning to sort of realize that this concept of a usable past is the common denominator. It's how that's defined and who it's useful to. That's the only difference, really. It's a shifting, kind of situation, and archaeologists invariably get caught in the middle. So, I'm not surprised to hear that this strange sort of what would be the word, collaborative, not even collaborative, like a combination of entities that you're describing in Bulgaria is, somehow maybe producing, at least in some ways, positive results, because that's not unexpected. And I don't necessarily want to imply that, identity politics is necessarily bad either. I mean, there's definitely, something to be said for being able to sort of use the past as a way to especially build up, for generations that possibly have not been able to experience that sense of belonging to something larger than themselves, for whatever reason. It might be a result of, years of war or economic sort of deprivation, what have you. There are all kinds of reasons why that would be a kind of positive force in a society. But at the same time, you can obviously illustrate the other side of it as well. And that's, I think most of us are going to be focusing on that aspect of it in today and tomorrow. But that flip side needs to be considered. And I don't know that the complex situation you're describing is going to be a permanent state. I mean, these things tend to go in cycles, as far as I can see. And of course, part of the problem is none of us live long enough. Our human lifespans are a little too short. So, we're forced to go back and try and reconstruct the choices that people made and the decisions that were made in previous generations based on a pretty incomplete record usually. So it's difficult to predict what will happen under certain conditions, at least in the area that you're working in. The outcomes could go one way or it could go another. It's yeah.
Okay. Just occurred to me that I forgot to call for a break after the presentation. We were supposed to have a 5 to 10 minutes break between the lecture and the discussion. I'm sorry about that, but it's too late now. I'm sorry. So it's now it's to Paulina.
Yes, I really liked your presentation and a very interesting statement that Europe doesn't support archaeology or heritage for that matter for building national identity anymore. However, it does support it if it's about European or EU identity. Again, with dealing with heritage policy, I dealt with this on European level on several occasions. And first thing is that it's called European, but the term as understood in Brussels is strictly limited to countries that are members of European Union. So if you're not a member of European Union, you are rejected to be considered European, which I always questioned and criticized. And I actually worked on preparation of several policy documents on EU level, dealing with heritage as a tool for building European identity. However, I always consider that anything that was ever created in Europe is automatically geographically European and therefore culturally European as well, whoever would have done it. And I've met with extremely strong opposition from colleagues from several other countries saying that this is not true. Only what helps in building European integrity is European and other things are not. We cannot call different, well, I don't want to go into very political discussion, but they've given some examples. And also some colleagues went to me during coffee breaks and told me that they think the same as I do, but if they would say that aloud, they wouldn't be invited as a representative of their government anymore. So this is the reality. And actually, once when I presented at actually it was a conference during the Bulgarian presidency, so it was, I think, 3 years ago or 4, I presented a program that we've designed in Poland based exactly on the rules of good practices designed for heritage programs developed in the European Union. But the aim of the program was to celebrate the centenary of Poland regaining its independence. It was a scandal. And as a result, I was the only one who wasn't asked to contribute to the publication. So this is how it works. Maybe this wasn't an archaeological example, but I also have an archaeological example. Archaeological heritage in general, it's most difficult to be put into those rails because it's really very, very distant, and to most people in most of our countries, I don't think, at least not in Poland, we don't have archaeology as part of the school curriculum. So people have basically very, very vague idea and mainly relate archaeology to Indiana Jones. So they don't really know what to think about the prehistory of their own land. So it's really, really difficult to use archaeological heritage as part of any policy building or political use. But a site which is, it's not my theory, or several people have written it already, the site that I'm sure, Bettina, you know, Biskupin, which is a late Bronze Age, early Iron Age fortified settlement in Western Poland. It was discovered in 1933 by Polish archaeologists. It was used to promote the idea of that it was pre-Slavonic, there as an opposition to German archaeology that promoted the idea of the supremacy of Germanic tribes in that part of the world as well. Then during the Second World War, it was excavated by the Nazis archaeologists trying to prove that it was Germanic after all. None of them succeeded. So after the war, the communists again used it even further as a pan-Slavonic example of some kind of a civilization that was always opposed to Germans. And when we could think that it's definitely over and it cannot be exploited in a political way in any other matter, in the 90s, it started to be promoted as an example of true European integrity because it's part of the Lusatian culture, which spread in half of Europe. So this is a perfect example how this European community had lived 2,500 years ago. So it's still there, and they use this not because they had to use it. They used it to justify their applications for EU funding, and that's how they got it. And they can run a huge museum that welcomes 250,000 visitors per year this way. So it's still the same. This is still the same thing.
Absolutely, that's a perfect example, actually, and it illustrates the, the way in which we just inscribe onto these sites that are effectively just, they are whatever they are, they, but it's about what we need now. That's basically then imposed on these sites with respect to how they're interpreted. And in this case, obviously, you can say following, both sort of political and economic motivations. You've got all of it in that one example. It's this continual presentist bias that, kind of gets really kind of, once it's in the mix, it's impossible to just talk about the archaeological record. And that for me is the biggest frustration.
But there is one difference, though, that I just realized. Whereas in the 1930s, Józef Kostrzewski, who discovered the site and investigated it, used it for propaganda reasons, or allowed it to be used for propaganda reasons. But thanks to that, he got enormous and unlimited funding for very professional research.
Okay.
But of course, it was all part of propaganda as well, but still the research was done on the highest possible methodological level of that time. And now, as you said, it's hardly ever for research. It's usually only for that, public surface.
Right. So that's in a way a transition then, that one example where you've got both. Yeah.
Although I think another problem is the fallacy of the economic boom that a site like this will bring to the area. The fact that many local communities, not just in Greece, I'm sure, but elsewhere also, believe that the institution of a new archaeological site or the building of a new museum will bring tourism and growth and all this, which is another fallacy, I think. Let's go to Clary.
It's a more general question. It was mentioned twice today in a somewhat negative manner that for archaeology to get support, it is inevitable to prove its relevance to present-day concerns. But isn't it the goal? I mean, what's the point of doing science for the sake of science?
So again, I think this is actually one of the things we should seriously consider deconstructing during this, the couple of days that we're together, because I'm perfectly willing to admit, because I've been trained in an anthropological paradigm, which was explicitly processual, actually, when I started in graduate school. And then you could argue I effectively had to find a way to combine the culture history that was still pretty much the dominant way of thinking about archaeological interpretation in Germany, because I had to work there, with the processual paradigm that I was trained in, and then the shifting, kind of landscape towards post-processual archaeology. So it's been difficult. It's been a tightrope walk of sorts. I definitely do not want to imply that we shouldn't be making, that's the best way to put this. I think it's important for us to point out the relevance for contemporary society when it emerges from the archaeological evidence that we're interpreting. The mistake, I think, is starting with an assumption and imposing that on the evidence. In other words, it's not necessarily, it's the directionality of it. The relevance piece is not a problem for me. And I think it's actually one of the reasons that I got into this field in the first place, because I can see that quite clearly. And it's certainly the way I teach, the courses I teach. But what's not good, or what's a problem, is when you start out with an assumption and then you refuse to accept any possible alternatives, even when they are present in the archaeological record. And that's when the political co-option comes into it. And the difficulty there can be that, I mean, again, we're thinking about, political abuse of the past in terms of big N nationalism. Again, National Socialist Germany, you know, and any number of other sort of examples that, you know, really, so they're writ large. So it's hard to avoid drawing the conclusion that this is not a good thing. It's harder to identify the potential negatives when it's not at that giant level, and it's not, you know, associated with something like the Holocaust, which, you know, at least to my way of thinking, it'd be very difficult to make an argument in favor of that. The problem becomes if similar arguments are made by groups that are in fact worthy of compassion or that are currently oppressed, but the argumentation is the same. In other words, you need to be able to separate the argument from the people making the argument, if that makes sense. The group itself should not be the focus. So it can be a you know, kind of, you can sympathize and still disagree. And that would be, again, the Chaco Canyon situation with the Navajo claims would be a good example of that. So yes, it's complicated.
It is complicated. And I think, if I may make an observation, since there's no other raised hand for the moment, I think the localist, the nationalist, the exceptionist agenda are deeply embedded in the make of our archaeologists, of our archaeological discipline. And when, even because you said that we need to be proactive and not just reactive, but even when we are, and believe me, in Greece, archaeologists, you know, do that. I mean, state archaeologists are always, you know, revolting against the state for this or other reason. But when they do, they take a deeply conservative stance. I mean, now everybody's against nationalization of cultural management. Everybody's against privatization. You mentioned that yourself quite a bit, but the argument against that is, but it belongs to the nation. It has to be, you know, property of the state. Cut the middleman, cut the private sector, cut foreigners. You know, it is suddenly you resort to 19th century archaeologists, or you know, first half of the 20th century archaeologists all over again. Which I don't think it's it could win the argument or make the necessary fuss, but it doesn't always make for a better archaeology. So you know, what you're asking, and I'm happy to subscribe to your you know, suggestion, is that we come up with a new epistemology for archaeology, a new way to formulate the agenda, not a new epistemology necessarily, but a new way to formulate our agenda.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that would be the ultimate goal, but I think we need to begin by actually making people aware of the fact that what they're doing is not neutral, even if they're doing cultural resource management archaeology. And that requires educating archaeologists, not just politicians. We've been sort of working it from both ends, but I think, you know, that there is a definite problem with that. It's been hard for me, certainly, to convince my colleagues even that you know, this type of training, what you're doing right now with the Spring School, should be required, actually, in my opinion. This type of deep dive into these sorts of issues, not just, you know, kind of training in field work, training in lab work, but on this larger epistemological level, and it doesn't happen in a lot of cases. And it took me quite a while before I was exposed to the political sort of underpinnings of all archaeological research. And actually, it was a weird situation. It was an East German archaeologist who had literally, he swam across the Danube in a wetsuit. This was before the wall came down, obviously. And he was on a Roman excavation site that I participated in. And at some point, and I was incredibly naive, I was an undergraduate, so I can sort of apologize for myself in that sense. But I said something about, again, objectivity, or, you know, but isn't, you know, there's always this true past. And he laughed at me. He said, what are you talking about? If you excavate a Roman fort on this side of the wall versus a Roman fort on that side of the wall, you start by not even excavating the same parts of the complex. In the East, we would have ended up excavating the vicus, because that's the kind of local population. That's where the emphasis is going to be, not the slaveholding Romans who built the fort, because they're all the same anyway, and why would you waste the money? And in the West, it's exactly the opposite. You run a trench through the Vicus just to figure out where it's located, and the fort is excavated in its entirety. And that's not even talking about the interpretation of the evidence. That's just starting with the research plan. How is that not political? There is no objective, kind of production of facts in that situation. And I hadn't even thought about it before. That was the first time that I became exposed to that idea, and it changed. I don't want to say everything, but it changed things in a way that I'm still wrestling with now. So I think that's really the key, because we can't make the arguments and defend ourselves successfully unless we understand actually how to kind of deal with these issues in our own house, as it were.
Anything else? We have a request from a visitor. Panayotis, are you with us?
Yes, good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon from London. I just wanted to ask, having heard the lecture and looked into and being a bit close to what I am working on now, currently my PhD, concerning the political use of art in general, and knowing that the art has been used in ancient times, from ancient times at least, as we think about it, for political uses, to pass on political messages, to promote political agendas. Could we kind of, refuse to allow the political reality of today to do the same thing, even though it does it with the same kind of art, with classical art or with any kind of art? So is there an ethical question from our part on this account? And again, do we have to look into who does the use of art concern? So is it a democratic elected government, or is it what we would call a less democratic state? Is there an ethical question from that front, on your opinion?
Wow, that's a tricky one. Well, we have someone here that actually does art history. I can't remember which of the presenters, but or participants. Wow, I'm not sure I even know where to start with that. It's an interesting point. Anybody have a thought? I think I'm still stuck at 2.
Well, I don't know. I'm his supervisor, so I should be the one.
You have an idea? Yeah.
I learned from my research that always the ideas came from the scientists into the politics. Mm-hmm. I don't find any example for a politician who said, well, let's look for our ancestors here also. Mm-hmm. It was always an offer from the scientific community into politics. And the next level of this mechanism was to lie about it. You know what I mean? After the Second World War, the scientific community create the narrative that politics used science for going to Poland, for fight against the whole world. And it was wrong. It is provable that the offers came from the community. They wrote applications for new museums, for excavations in the nowhere of the east of Brandenburgia. It was absolutely unimportant. The sites were not in danger or so. The offer for an excavation came from the scientists. And I would say that mechanism still works until today. We, in the newspapers, I never read about a scientifical educated politician who created an idea in our subjects. It comes from the science, and we have to think about it. We have to think about what is good science, what is good scientific practice. If you would say, like Professor Niculescu, if we check always our methods and our goals, and if we talk very clearly about the things which are possible to prove, then we are on the safe side, I would say. But if you promise this, if you promise the audience or the politicians a gold rush in a region which is completely unimportant, they will trust you, of course. So I think the responsibility is always on our side, because we, since more than 100 years, the scientists are the main actors in that game, I would say.
You've got two hands up now.
Yeah, okay, so Alec and then Natalia, and then of course we will need to answer Panagiotis' question in the end. But, okay, Alec?
Yes, I agree, it's our responsibility, but still, how did the archaeologists know what the politicians would like to have? That means there was a political message. The archaeologists interpreted.
Also, Susanne, when I said that it was nationalism that created archaeology and not the other way around, I meant when it did in the 19th century. You said the last 100 years. Well, yes, but in the last 200 years, archaeology did not exist before nationalism. It was the other way around. You know, even CRM in historically, the first calls anywhere in Europe, and especially Greece and Italy, to restore amphitheaters, ancient theaters, or sites, or sanctuaries, for tourism or for enhancing national associations, came from politicians and managers. And then it was not the archaeologists who had the idea historically, who came up with the idea of restoring sites. It was always in the agenda of the political runners of the country. I mean, first we had Greece, and then we had archaeology in Greece. This is how it came. So this is what I meant. Obviously, now we know the agendas. We're part of the agendas. We're part of the committees now, and for the last 100 years, absolutely, that's true. But then again, as Alex says, how do we know? Well, because they tell us. They tell us. The reason why, I mean, in the 1970s, there was this massive find in North Greece, in Macedonia, Vergina, attributed by the excavator to the royal dynasty. He was able to go on and complete the excavation, partly because the find was spectacular, but also because the head, you know, the president of Greece at the time, Konstantinos Karamanlis, went there and said, "Well, tell me what you want, and I'm going to give it to you." And he almost pushed for the right historical attribution of the tomb, promising the necessary funds. No other excavation in Greece at the time had access to such funds. Obviously, Andronikos knew how to play his game, but who taught him how to do it? That's the idea.
Yeah.
We have also.
That's next. Let's
yeah, we have Natalia and then Paulina. Natalia? I think we lost Natalia.
Frozen. I will cancel the camera so I can.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have two questions. Second one is much easier. First, thank you, Professor Bettina, for this really thought-provoking presentation. The question is, when archaeology stops, and does it stop, when it comes to site management, having in mind that we all are witnessing different uses and abuses of heritage sites. So in your experience, how do you see archaeology in that process? And the second one was, could you please repeat the name of the site with waterlogged chamber, the one you were talking about, the great financial support? Thank you.
You mean the first one she discussed?
Yes, the example where the excavation and conservation got really big financial support and
yeah, in the beginning of the lecture. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I'll answer that one first. Then it's part of the Heuneburg project. There's a sort of larger umbrella now under which most of that funding has been sort of spent, but that particular excavation was billed as a rescue because they had done some GPR on a very large mound in the Danube Plain, and apparently that somehow got to it became public, and metal detectorists were spotted in the area. So that was the rationale that was provided for excavating it. In terms of and it's called the Bettelbühl, by the way, BETTELBU umlaut HL. If you want, Natalia, you can just send me an email and I'll provide you with some additional information on that one. The other question about when do we stop being sort of associated with sites as archaeologists, that's an interesting point, because I mean, you could argue never. It depends a little bit, right, on how long it takes to actually process all the finds and analyze everything and publish and so on. I think there's, on some level, you probably should consider it a permanent sort of obligation, which is for, again, a distinction made between, let's say, cultural resource management excavations and research projects that you actually may set in train that wouldn't otherwise have happened. And I would make a distinction, because nobody could be expected, if they're working in heritage management and they're excavating, I don't know how many sites a year, there's a structure there, and your responsibility begins and ends with whatever your job is when you're working in that kind of context. But it's a different thing if you actually choose to excavate, as we did, and there is a research design associated with it and so on. I think then you really have an obligation to continue to find a way to work to preserve and make sure that the site is given adequate attention. At minimum, get it published, which we're still trying to do.
And Paulina, and yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to refer to what Alex said, that he asked, how do scientists, researchers get this message from politicians? I think it's very simple, and it's been like this, I guess, since the beginning of time. It's with money, with providing legal framework or financial framework for doing whatever is important at the moment. And I've again worked with designing a lot of granting schemes, and it's been the same way always. If in the Renaissance some rich fat and short guy wanted to be presented as a mighty knight, he would have been presented by the artist as a mighty knight, and this framework still works. I'm sorry, if we would say tomorrow that we have a call for projects to prove that Copernicus was a woman, we would get applications, research programs proving that Copernicus was a woman. And Bettina just said about publications, how important it is, obviously. So actually, this is the only case I had when we designed an archaeological granting scheme that at the beginning wasn't approved by archaeologists, because it didn't fund field work. It only funded working on old materials, old documentations from excavations that was never published. It's a huge issue everywhere, and we decided to have a special granting scheme only to work on those old materials, sometimes 50, 60, or 70 years old, trying to make out of it what's possible after so many years in order to put it into the scientific stream. And this was really highly criticized, but with time it survived, and now it's, I think, it's a publishing series that has become quite professional. So I think we have the saying that if you don't know what's going on, it must be about the money. So And I'm afraid that this is a big part of it.
Okay, and I think we should be closing soon, but Zenda has a remark first or a question.
I have a comment from my side of a rather poor country. And when I think about what politicians want from us and what they expect from archaeology, then my thoughts is that they don't want much, actually. We are always asked for profit, for money, for raising GDP and such things. And in my country, at least, I don't see ideologies, politics behind it all. Actually, once our prime minister was asked what's the goal of our country is, and she was really, really confused and answered that our goal is wealth. So from a poor country, I would say that the money is the reasoning behind everything. And this is no more a century of big ideas. It's rather profit. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I don't know if Professor Arnold would like to make a closing statement. Of course, there's also always tomorrow.
Yeah, I think not, actually. I'll be picking up some of these themes again, but also adding others tomorrow. And so if people still have lingering issues, we can discuss them then.
Fine. So if there's nothing else, see you all tomorrow. Thank you for this excellent day. I'm sure Alec and Diana and myself are all three very excited and very happy with the way this project has started to be materialized. So see you all tomorrow, 11, I think. Right? I mean, whatever, whatever your time zone is, but you know, do the calculations and be there on time. So until tomorrow, bye everyone.
Bye bye.